chosen topic for today's lecture was triggered by a series of groundbreaking incidents in 2014 that almost brought the University of Ghana on a head-on collision with the NDC government. And when I say the incidents were groundbreaking, I also mean it literally. Well, it involved a theater of serial demolition of structures at the university, followed by serial acts of reconstruction, the raising down of a newly constructed security gate or toll booth, its restoration by the university, and a second reprisal demolition, followed again by another reconstruction. So then, construction, demolition, reconstruction, repeat demolition, and now an ongoing reconstruction effort, which stands a greater chance of survival, probably because the ferocious land guard is currently at large. The drama is reminiscent of a difficult landlord perpetually at war with an equally intransigent tenant. The two litigants haven't mutually agreed that action speaks louder than words. But it also recalls serial attempts by AMA to demolish unauthorized structures at Sodom and Gomorrah, and the bold resistance put up by defiant squatters whose broken structures, like flattened anthills, resurface overnight, with most reconstructions carefully timed to coincide with election years, where governments prudently give up the fight in order to save votes. The exception being that whereas Sodom and Gomorrah demolitions were staged in broad daylight under television cameras, the vandalism on Legon was nocturnal, clandestinely executed to convey self-awareness of wrongdoing. But perfectly authorized structures belonging to the state had been pulled down in the past. Rewind, 1979, the original market, Makola Market number 2, out of 2 Makolas at the time, was reduced to a rubble by state security, partly to teach a lesson to unpatriotic retailers who sold goods at Kalabule prices against the tenets of the June 4th revolution. The demolition was motivated by a desire to speedily fix a broken economy bedeviled by shortages, hoarding of essential commodities, high food prices, and the like. And it was a signal that a new era had dawned when indiscipline at the retail market would no longer be tolerated. Years later, when normalcy was restored and we learned that bad economics were not fixed by assault on retailers, we restored our passion for constitutional democracies where broken economies are fixed by ballots rather than bullets. Nearly 40 years after the revolution, 2014, deep into uninterrupted cycles of constitutional democracy, the state sponsors a demolition squad to virtually pulverize a gateway or toll booth belonging to Legon, whose construction had been previously authorized and even applauded. This happened at the time Ghana's democratic credentials had been widely acclaimed. One can only plead for a public hearing of this sort that seeks to subject surviving relics to further scrutiny and put the tragic episode in a wider historical perspective. The drama is perhaps over, but the University of Ghana still hurts, and in 2016 decides formally to commemorate the event by giving a name to the battleground where the historic duel was fought. The combat zone, a site of pain and memory, is now called the Academic Freedom Road. The now famous road, located near the Legon Stadium, is only a few yards away from monuments named after past vice-chancellors, the Akila Pasoya Road, the George Bennett Circle, Havana Mensa intersection, the entire cluster of historic icons at the university's entrance welcomes any guest to a proud history of academic leadership and the values of freedom they championed. But this lecture also gives opportunities to present a history of encounters between universities and governments over the years and how these have helped to shape the landscape of academic freedom. The concept of academic freedom, even if we did not understand it during our days in the 1970s, conveyed a sense of liberation from social and political constraints. In our days long ago, the most visible landmark that reminded the new student of this newly discovered world was a signboard at the entrance of the main gate that simply said, University of Ghana, private property. It was not clear what privacy meant exactly, since the university had always been a public institution. Later, we learned privacy largely meant the university was not a thoroughfare. Furthermore, the space demarcated for the purpose was a distinctive site marked by identifiable norms and mores. But the university's uniqueness as a site could also be marked by both ecology and architecture. The hill on which it stood lent the university considerable majesty and prominence. But there was also an imposing tower, the Great Tower of Learning, visible from all angles, that penetrated the horizon, virtually reaching out to the elements. The symbolism that Legon and universities in general represent as distinct spaces is further strengthened by the meaning of the word Legon itself. Of course, it was called Legon long before the land was donated to government by the people of Labadi for the construction of a university. Legon means in Ghana the hill of knowledge, perhaps an ancient retreat for philosophers. But the university meant something else. There was a felt sense of security as soon as you entered the four walls of the university. Thus, even if you were being pursued by an unknown assailant from the city center and you managed to cross the line and enter the private space, you were somehow protected under the freedom banner, which insulated you from arrest, harassment, or persecution, we thought. Here was a campus where no policeman could anyhow enter and arrest a student or lecturer for any offense whatsoever. It is indeed a fact that to this day, no member of the university community can be arrested by any law enforcement agency while he or she is on campus without the consent of the vice-chancellor or his representative. Somehow, there was a felt sense of academic immunity, even if it was illusory. Additionally, based on several unsavory incidents in the past, the university to this day observes the norm of ensuring that no contingent of police ever enters its walls without prior invitation by the university authorities. These steps taken by the university were partly informed by past experiences where attempts were made to subject universities to direct political control, occupation, and the community was subjected to harassment for political reasons. An important test case was 1993, when the University of Ghana established a private radio station, now called Radio Universe, the first private radio station in Ghana, completely run by students. I was the Dean of Students then. Known then as the Voice of Legon, the station had been given license to restrict its range of transmission up to the Tetekwashi Circle, now an interchange, less than 10 kilometers radius. But when the university and Professor George Bene purchased for us a bigger transmitter, we did not quite feel obliged to renew our application and brazenly began broadcasting to Greater Accra, Swedro, and beyond from our site, which was close to the university gate. One morning, we got unusual visitors from the National Communications Authority, which, without consultations with the university authorities, entered the university premises and studios and ordered us to stop operations since we were violating the laid down terms for experimental broadcasting. That apparently also prohibited us from broadcasting beyond 9 p.m. This breach of university protocol to invade Radio Universe inflamed passions among the student body that was championing the birth of press freedom. While transmission continued unabated, the students quietly dared anybody to come from government or any of its agencies and halt operations of Radio Universe, since we were in a constitutional era. where we thought no extra permission indeed was needed to start a radio station or broadcast beyond Accra. In truth, of course, we knew the NDC government was reacting to a hard-hitting commentary on national issues. The vandals from Commonwealth Hall led the crusade and took turns to collectively keep vigil around the radio station over a week until the footsteps of the National Communications Authority receded into the distance. The history of press freedom in this country cannot be told without the role played by the University of Ghana radio station in championing the freeing of the airwaves. For the station had been formed to provide a channel for the unfettered exercise of academic freedom, the freedom to construct and disseminate knowledge, utilize the radio station to disseminate research findings, to subject national issues to critical analysis, and also critically consider and address pertinent issues bordering on university policy. If the government just emerging from a revolution was jittery, it was perhaps because the nation had gotten used to a single state-owned radio station, GBC, which could be whimsically taken over by any adventurist to announce a military takeover. But here you were with a radio station with an emerging constitutional democracy located at the university that at various times had seen the long hand of government in its academic life. The incident narrated partly bordered on the violation of university space without due process, as well as attempts to gag the university within the context of constitutional democracy. But it is better understood against a background narration of intermittent government interference with intellectual freedom, largely from the 1960s till the 1990s. On the other hand, it is also a proud history that has produced its own role of courageous vice-chancellors, governing councils, management, faculty, and students that have fiercely fought to safeguard Ghana's intellectual freedom. What indeed is academic freedom, and how compatible is it within the university settings, as well as areas where natural freedoms are restricted? It has been observed that as society expands and its needs become more and more complex, deeper intellectual inquiries need to be used to address emerging challenges of development. The human and material resources needed to prosecute such roles can best be found in universities and other institutions of higher learning and research. The concept of a university itself was originally of a classical character. The university, in the classical sense, was for a man of leisure who would enjoy exercising his intellect for its own sake. The main objective of the university was simply the discipline of the mind. The university best suited for the purpose was a place completely distanced from the rest of society, an ivory tower, endowed with adequate intellectual resources, and which provided an auspicious climate for intellectual pursuits. I've chosen this prelude to emphasize the peculiar nature in which universities find themselves the world over, as citadels or quintessential sites or embodiments of academic freedom as an end in itself. Indeed, academic freedom simply conveys the conviction that freedom of inquiry by students and faculty is key in prosecuting the university's core mission. Scholars, indeed, should have the freedom to teach, learn, and communicate ideas without censure, harassment, or persecution. It is founded on the notion that scholarship attains its ultimate fulfillment if scholars have unlimited liberty to question received wisdom and also advance controversial and even unpopular opinions without fear of censure. Secondly, academic institutions have no right to constrain the exercise of this freedom by students and staff or use it as a ground for disciplinary action. It is indeed contended that academic freedom promotes intellectual diversity and helps to achieve a university's primary goal, which is the pursuit of truth. In the humanities and social sciences, it means exposing the students to a variety of sources and viewpoints and not presenting just one viewpoint. In universities, an associated feature of academic freedom is institutional autonomy. The institution's freedom to appoint its administrators or faculty. For academic freedom thrives best within an auspicious national climate where democratic freedoms are upheld and espoused, and where national laws insulate institutions of higher learning against interference in research and governance. Act 195 Clause 3 of the 1992 Constitution, for example, vests power in the Governing Council of Universities to appoint persons to hold office in a body of higher education, research, or professional training. This clause insulates the university against the imposition by government for example, a chancellor or vice-chancellor or any other influential appointee. The university's laws and statutes in turn ensure that a vice-chancellor is appointed without reference to government. Unlike the 1961 Constitution and previous university statutes, the head of state in the current University of Ghana statutes or basic laws is no longer the chancellor of the university. The situation was, however, different in the 1961 Constitution, which made the president of Ghana, in that case Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the chancellor of the university. The same convention enabled Colonel Kutu Achampong, chairman of the SMC, to assume the position of chancellor when he took over power in 1972. The 1979 Constitution, however, changed the situation and gave the university its autonomy. But before the university could appoint its own chancellor, the Provisional National Defense Council took over power in 1981, and in accordance with PNDC Law 239, the chairman of the PNDC, Jerry Rawlings, became chancellor of the university. It took, of course, the 1992 Constitution, 11 years after, to restore the autonomy of universities, giving them the power to appoint their own office holders, including chancellor. This presupposes that respective universities and institutions of higher learning would ensure that their own internal regulations and norms are not in conflict with the freedoms enshrined in the national constitution, and that individuals, students, lecturers, academics are free to deal with the subject matter the way they want it, agree or disagree with the viewpoint of a superior or subordinate without fear of sanctions, intimidation, harassment, or persecution. The university itself will be obliged to provide an enabling climate for the exercise of academic freedom, including the provision of the relevant resources that facilitate the unfettered exercise of academic freedom. It also infers that lecturers will not impose views on students and would respect students' right to dissent. But if this sense of academic freedom conveys the impression of unlimited liberties, it also perhaps puts a higher premium on the classical sense of a university. For in reality, the university in the modern day does not operate in a vacuum. If the past concept of the ivory towered intellectual has faded over time, it only means universities have been compelled over the years to make themselves relevant to the job market. As Williams sees it, education should be the process of the development of the whole man to be fully integrated with the relevant moral and spiritual forces in society. The immediate as well as the ultimate purpose of education should be the actual improvement of life on this planet. Here, scholarship will be sensitive to the use of knowledge to address the pressing needs of society. For the intellectual in every society is bound to reckon with the social and political realities of the time and seek to improve them. This implies that academic freedom is no license to engage in intellectual pursuits that are of little relevance to society. Indeed, any university that still adheres to the classical concept of a university as a disengaged ivory tower writes its own obituary. The concept of ivory tower is still compatible with the expectation that the university and its product should be relevant to society and to the job market. This is, after all, what is meant by taking the gown to town. I highlight the issue of relevance to emphasize that though academic staff are at liberty in the name of academic freedom to plan their syllabi and academic curricula, institutional intervention is constantly needed to come to terms with cutting-edge scholarship as well as ensure harmony and synergy between intellectual output and national needs. But let me also point out that the enjoyment of academic freedom does not preclude the right to several other constitutional freedoms, including freedom of worship and so on and so forth. Regulated and regulations and bylaws, however, are all beholden to the national constitution. Furthermore, even if university and student regulations contain nothing that conflicts with national laws, the university ensures that specific clauses stipulated within SRC constitutions are in compliance with their objective as a university. But by far the commonest threat to academic freedom in this country and several developing countries are threats from government, or rather dictatorial political regimes. Indeed, the fortunes of academic freedom over the years have coincided with the fortunes of democratic governance. Academic freedom has considerably thrived during democratic regimes and suffered egregious abuse during one-party dictatorships and military interventions. As constitutional democracy gets more and more consolidated, one would expect academic freedom to take firmer and firmer roots. And this is largely because when universities begin asserting their autonomy as centers of academic freedom, exercising the freedom to criticize public policy, they easily become objects of suspicion by insecure governments. The outcome has invariably been an orchestrated scheme of subjecting the institution to control, infiltrating their ranks, intimidation, harassment, in extreme cases, terminating appointments. And this has happened over and over again since Nkrumah days and has considerably declined along the consolidation of democracy. Nkrumah and the CPP. This anti-intellectual posturing began with the populist CPP government, which espoused anti-bourgeoisie populist ideologies and perceived the university as an enclave of opposition forces and subverts merely parading as intellectuals. To Nkrumah, even though universities were indispensable in national development, the concept of academic freedom in its ideal manifestations was a threat to political order, so long as it could be used as a pretext for political subversion. Bringing the university under the control of government did not only mean dealing with intellectuals, it also meant politicizing the university and seeing the government's hand in the appointment of politically loyal vice-chancellors and chairmen and members of the university councils, as well as reserving the position of the university chancellor itself for the president. It is not surprising then that included on the University of Ghana Council in the 1960s were CPP members of parliament such as Kofi Bakun, FKD Goka, Tewia Damafio, and Kofi Asante Oforiatta. In October 1963, Nkrumah ordered the vice-chancellor to start a party ideological training course in the university, at which party functionaries would lecture. And furthermore, the party would be represented on the University Council, Academic Board, and faculty boards, partly as a way of strengthening party education in the university. The Vice-Chancellor, however, firmly refused to implement these party-oriented educational reforms, setting the stage for a clampdown on the university. Subsequently, Nkrumah made it clear that only those who would comply with his wish to bend the university to his will could get the post of Vice-Chancellor. But academic freedom was even more directly assaulted. In 1964, Nkrumah announced the setting up of a committee under the chairmanship of a professor with powers to inspect publications in bookshops and in the libraries of schools, colleges, and universities, and ensure removal from the country of all publications which did not reflect the party's ideology or are antagonistic to its ideals. Then, of course, came the spate of dismissals and deportations of academic staff on grounds of subversion, as from 1961, when 6 members of staff had their contracts terminated. In 1964, a Ghanaian professor was placed in preventive detention. 6 other members of staff, including 4 Americans, 1 West Indian and 1 Englishman, were deported. But the war on intellectuals was also waged through allied media agencies, like the Evening News, which was the organ of the CPP. The attack on Legon intellectuals was waged through media critique of the university's academic curriculum. In a February 1964 edition of the Evening News, they chastised the University of Ghana as follows. The university, in the colonialist epoch, catered for the interests of the upper ranks of African society, and its fundamental aim was to build an upper class of indigenous elite, faithful to the interests of the foreign power, which in the case of Ghana was Britain imperialism. This is proved by a detailed study of curriculum in a colonial university. In an African country which has low standards of literacy, health, housing, and in which colonial rule has left mass poverty in its wake, the colonial university offered courses in bourgeois abstract philosophy and anti-people law. Instead of settling down to real problems of health, education, industrial science, and people's economy, or encouraging research in the advanced sciences, the colonialists, working through Bam and Busia, established a reactionary tradition of bourgeois intellectualism. That's the Evening News. And they continue, there is no excuse whatsoever for students to be loitering aimlessly after dinner, discussing not the latest uses of the atom or the mysteries of spaceflight or even Shakespeare, but counter-revolutionary plans how to organize demonstrations and general subversive talk. The university itself was closed down in 1964 to prevent protests by the students against a farcical referendum. Professors and students were detained at the time, and the masses, led by party thugs, staged a massive demonstration against the university in early 1964. The clampdown on the university was preceded by a threat in a February edition of the Evening News, captioned "Shame Anti-Colonial Lecturers," part of which read as follows. The universities think they have been ordained by metaphysical powers to lord it over to the common people, not knowing that the masses can uproot them from the academic freedom, that the freedom to act contrary to the wishes and manifesto of the party and government, and the freedom to conspire with Western capitalist agents against the African Revolution. The subversive groups among the lecturers, those who conspired with reactionary students one moment and then pretended to hold them in check, we know them all and we shall crush them. Quote. The above account of the protracted impasse between Nkrumah and the CPP on one hand and intellectuals on the other naturally puts in a better perspective his apparent mistrust of intellectuals as the nucleus of his decision-making body and his preference for veranda boys. It also marks an attempt not just to silence, but also alienate the intellectual, disabling him from any meaningful participation in national life. Consider, for instance, this paragraph of an editorial attack on intellectuals in a February edition of the Evening News. The fantastic notion that universities, bourgeois alone, are fit for governmental and administrative work does not hold water. In fact, it usually turns out that the intellectual, laden with chains of academic letters, is subversive, a saboteur, a bad worker, whereas the middle-of-the-road worker does his best to produce concrete work on behalf of our people. Some products of the colonialist universities are well known for their laziness, general irresponsibility, and complacency, with a few exceptions. The few exceptions the party had in mind, I think, were possibly in the character of intellectual advisors surrounding Nkrumah. Apart from a few intellectuals in government, Nkrumah found the best use of intellectuals in advisory roles. In 1963, he had indeed gone on a hunt for talented intellectuals and discovered in Oxford a young professor of philosophy in his mid-30s, whom he persuaded to return to Ghana and join his team of advisors. Professor Willie Abraham thus became one of the confidants of Kwame Nkrumah, even while he lectured in the philosophy department at Legon. Nkrumah set up a special secretariat for him within the philosophy department, where he combined academic and political duties. At the resignation of Chris O'Brien in '65, Abraham, the pro-vice chancellor at the time, was appointed acting vice chancellor of the university, a position he held until the coup that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah. In 1995, nearly 30 years after he left Ghana, I and Professor Ayindoho, on a trip to the USA, looked for Professor Abraham, who was at the University of California in Santa Cruz, USA. Abraham recalled some of the challenges in combining academic and political roles under the prevailing political system. He, for instance, recalled a request by Nkrumah to take over the university's Agric Research Station at Nungua and turn it into a national asset. This request, of course, was firmly but politely turned down by Abraham on the ground that the station was a research facility used for demonstration by the Faculty of Agric. This negative response supposedly upset the president, who came later himself with a delegation to express concern, according to Abraham. Nkrumah's love-hate relationship with intellectuals played out in deep irony when he founded the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1959 with himself and his arch-political rival J.B. Danquah and 18 others as foundation members. The Academy's agenda was to promote high standards in all fields of learning in the service of national development. It is significant that on Nkrumah's overthrow in 1966, the Academy decided to dismiss Kwame Nkrumah, the founder of the Academy, partly due to the embarrassment he had brought to the Academy as a tyrant, but also the atrocities his regime meted out to J.B. Danquah, who was a fellow of the Academy. Even though Nkrumah's membership of the Academy was posthumously restored in the early 90s, the incident symbolically sealed the intractable impasse between Nkrumah and his intellectual pals. But in narrating the tension between Nkrumah intellectuals, one needs to salute the leadership of the University of Ghana at various times between 1957 and 1966, who fiercely stood against government intrusions and fought for the university's autonomy through advocacy, protestations, and principal resignations. Three such heroes are R.H. Stoughton, principal of the University College from 1958 to 1961, who resigned when Nkrumah threatened mass dismissal of Legon academics. The academic board that once threatened mass resignation, and Cruz O'Brien, vice chancellor from 1962 to 1965, who astutely fought to preserve the university's academic autonomy, resisting state intrusions, and eventually resigning his position as vice chancellor. Significantly, Cruz O'Brien, who resigned protesting the Nkrumah's political intrusions at the university, has been immortalized by Legon through a street named after him in front of the chemistry department. On Nkrumah's overthrow in 1966, the long period of silence on the intellectual front appeared to be over. Remarkably, the University of Ghana, whose freedom had been badly battered by the Nkrumah ideology, openly placed on record the university's immense gratitude to the gallant men of the Ghana Army and Police who overthrew him. Legon went further. They later awarded honorary doctoral degrees to two of the coup makers, General Akosua Mankwa Afrifa and John W.K. Halley, Commissioner of Police, who were members of the NLC. Ghanaian universities further took the opportunity to purge themselves of Nkrumahs in their midst, including the Vice Chancellor of the University of Science and Technology, Dr. R.P. Bafo, whose removal was engineered by students of UST. In Legon, the chairman of the University Council, on his part, called on members of staff whose intellectual faith in Nkrumah had not been shaken by his overthrow to, quote, be patriotic and leave the campus for the good of the campus, unquote. Additionally, all books written by Kwame Nkrumah were banned, and those available on shelves in universities across the country were retrieved and set on fire by opponents of Kwame Nkrumah. This uncharacteristic move, Mr. Chairman, by a university asserting itself as a newly regained freed institution, demonstrated how such a great academic institution, University of Ghana, sank itself so low and rendered itself liable to reciprocal charges of intellectual persecution and egregious violations of academic freedom. But the swift, almost vengeful reaction to Nkrumah's overthrow was also because the universities had found it impossible during the government university impasse to fulfill their normal role of providing a forum for the critical appraisal of contemporary issues without let or hindrance. During the first congregation after Nkrumah's overthrow, the Vice-Chancellor, Alexander Kwapong, in his State of the University address, noted, for instance, that between 1964 and 1966, during Nkrumah's one-party dictatorship, no serious journal was published in Legon, and there were no open lectures on matters of contemporary and topical interest. On Nkrumah's overthrow, intellectuals resolved never again to sit on the fence and be silent in the face of oppression. That resolve indeed marked the birth of the Legon Society for National Affairs, made up of dons from various academic disciplines. The LSNA, whose organ was the fortnightly Legon Observer, became the mouthpiece of the oppressed. Looking back in the days of Kwame Nkrumah era, when scholars were subdued in silence and fear, the Legon Observer, in its debut editorial in July 1966, related an unsavory history of press emasculation and intellectual alienation, and vowed, quote, never again to remain quiet if our liberties are being invaded and curtailed, hoping that somebody else would eventually perform any risky obligation for us, unquote. The checkered fortunes of Legon Observer, since the above course was charted, are very well known. It sailed through the NLC and Progress Party governments from 1966 to 1972 and went through various types of censorship until August 1982, nearly a year after Rawlins's second coming, when it finally disappeared from the newsstand, and after an extensive critical commentary on the mysterious murder of the 3 High Court judges and a retired army officer, a scandal the paper bluntly said was state-sponsored. From 2008 to 2010, the Legon Observer resurfaced through the initiatives of Ernest Aite and others, but it didn't survive. K.A. Buzier's short-lived regime from 1969 to 72 appeared to consolidate the spirit of cooperation between governments and intellectuals, partly because of the democratic principles its government espoused, but also because there was a preponderance of the elite and academics in Buzier's government, Buzier himself being an Oxford scholar of international repute. The Buzier government's favorable disposition towards academics and the broad ambience of intellectual freedom did not completely stave off tension. Buzier's proposal for a fee-paying university was considered detrimental to the tenets of intellectual freedom, so long as a majority of promising students from poor homes would thereby be deprived of university education. Even so, a major student protest over a proposed payment of fees for boarding and lodging at the universities, coupled with a confrontation between the NUCs and Parliament over non-declaration of assets, soured the smooth relations. This was soon followed by an open confrontation of K.A. Buzier on the Legon campus by a Legon graduate student of political science, one Ebo Hatchful, who is now a professor at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. The confrontation took place in front of the university bookshop, where the student, feeling insulated by academic freedom, verbally attacked Buzier over material acquisitions by members of his government, despite prior claims of modesty. The student was arrested by Buzier's bodyguards and was instantly released on the directives of the Prime Minister, Buzier. General R.K. Achampon's 7-year dictatorship brought back the historic tension between government and intellectuals. After an initial flash of cooperation, relations turned sour when students and academics noticed signs of deterioration in the economy, corruption, and moral degeneration among public officials, and what looked like Achampon's agenda to perpetuate his rule through the proposal of a union government. Anti-government demonstrations by university students erupted countrywide, so the several police-student confrontations which led to fatalities. Academic work in the universities was perennially destabilized between 1974 and 1978. Student protests included one in 1977 against the premature retirement by government of 2 professors. In 1978, when students protested against the arrest by the military of 3 students and a professor, it cost the university 7 more weeks of closure. The climax of students-police encounter occurred in January 1978, when students of Legon demonstrated against General Champon and symbolically interred his Unigov proposal through a mock burial at the entrance of the university, which led to an invasion of the university by the police. Significantly, the period also saw considerable politicization of academic unions. University teachers played an active role in the association of professional bodies that protested at Champon's political agenda through strikes and seminars. A few vocal intellectuals like Professor Dubois also spearheaded anti-government political movements like the Movement for Freedom and Justice, which opposed at Champon's Unigov. It was also a time when 2 also intellectuals were clamped in jail for alleged involvement in subversion. Over a period of 4 years, academic work on university campuses was interrupted about a dozen times through closures by other government or university authorities. There was also an era, this was an era when deteriorating economic conditions in the country led to a mass exodus of intellectuals and other professionals for greener pastures outside the country. Between 1977 November and November 1978, the University of Ghana lost 45 full-time lecturers through the resignations and appointment and vacation of posts. Added to the number that tactically left on sabbatical leave and leave of absences or resigned as research fellows, the university lost altogether 114 academics. And between 1978 and 79, the university lost another 88 senior members and recruited only 47. Not only did the university lose some of its brains, the concept of academic and professional started losing its meaning. Lecturers left behind spent less time on the job and sought other incomes. A few lecturers converted their cars into taxis and operated them commercially after classes. The situation thus was not just an endemic impasse between the pen and the sword. It was also the onset of a decline in academic standards. The university bookshops were depleted, and the growth of university libraries came to a halt. Building projects in the universities were abandoned for lack of funds. And a classical example of that is the current Faculty of Arts building, which was started in the previous century, 1971. And as of today, 30th of May 2017, how many years thereafter, is still yet to be completed. When it gets completed, it will be on record as having been the most protracted building effort in any academic institution. The Liman era, from 79 to 81, was short-lived, and there were no notable incidents bordering on intellectuals and government. The posturing of Jerry Rawlings on the issue of intellectuals poses a bigger dilemma, owing to the complexity of his political machinery. Rawlings' empowerment of the grassroots at the very onset of the revolution in 1979 sent an unambiguous message to the elite that their days were over. Power had now devolved into the hands of the grassroots. In various speeches, JJ did not hide his aversion for intellectuals as against the ordinary man in the streets. In various speeches in 94 through 96, he routinely slammed intellectual dishonesty, particularly where knowledge has not been galvanized for the common good of the people. Significantly, his articulations about intellectuals were sometimes reminiscent of Kwame Nkrumah. Like Nkrumah, Rawlings often expressed concern about intellectualism for its own sake, saying elsewhere, I quote, "What is the use of theoretical knowledge if it cannot be applied. The intellectual is someone who puts his knowledge to practice. This posturing against the classical intellectual who generates knowledge as an end in itself is not dissimilar to that of Kwame Nkrumah, who says, quote, "True academic freedom, the intellectual freedom of the university, is everything that is compatible with the service to the university and to the community. For the university is and must always remain a living thing and serving part of the community to which it belongs," unquote. The truth, of course, is that both Nkrumah and Rawlings lumped the university together as opposition constituencies, which were scheming to unseat governments. Any climate of liberalism that could be utilized to sow dissension against governments is a threat from this perspective. It is perhaps no accident that groups opposed to Nkrumah and Rawlings in real times had the universities as one of their biggest support bases. Significantly, even though both of them during their days of dictatorship were respectively Vice-Chancellor of the University of Ghana and occasionally sneered at intellectuals, Jerry Rawlings, unlike Kwame Nkrumah, did not use that position to dismiss lecturers or clamp down on their freedoms. On the other hand, the rift between the Rawlings regime and universities found further expression in the number of confrontations between PNDC and NDC on one hand and the universities. From 1982 to 1996, under both PNDC and NDC, the University of Ghana was closed down at least 8 times. With the exception of the period from January to April 1982, 4 months, when the universities were closed down to release students to evacuate cocoa. All other closures were caused by tensions between students and lecturers on one hand and government. But a memorable incident occurred in 1983 when the government closed down the University of Ghana and dispatched what came to be known as an occupation force of revolutionary cadres to the campus to do a course. During the long occupation, the cadres did a lot of damage to university property and significantly molested some lecturers of the university, one of whom had his beard set on fire, and we know him. As a result of these disruptions in the academic calendar, the University of Ghana lost altogether 32 months, about 2.5 years of academic work. Consequently, one stream of applicants for admission to the university in 1996 missed their turn because the university was closed and joined the next stream. The double intake the following year became partly responsible for an over-bloated student population from which the university did not easily recover. Kufuor's 8-year rule did not raise many pertinent issues about intellectual freedom. There were a few student demonstrations against university authorities which spread into town, and incidents where demonstrating students were beaten up by the police. One important incident, bordering on academic freedom and institutional autonomy, however, did not pass unnoticed. It had to do with a rather unusual incident at the University of Development Studies in 2005, where the university's attempt to confer an honorary doctorate degree on former President J.J. Rawlings was aborted under rather bizarre circumstances. On January 17, 2005, the UDS Academic Board had decided to honor 6 distinguished individuals, including the then President J. Kufuor and Flight Lieutenant J.J. Rawlings. On January 20th, the UDS Council approved the decision of the Academic Board. The special occasion, which had been scheduled for March 19, 2005, however, was called off at the 11th hour on the directive of the chairman of UDS Council, who cited security reasons for the cancellation. This explanation was of course not convincing. Was it because Rawlings was going to receive honors under a Kufuor government? Whether this was from the long arm of government or was an exercise in self-censorship by the UDS Council is hard to tell. But the whole issue was revisited by the Council of UDS in October 2013 during the term of President John Mahama, when the honorary doctorate degree, whose conferment was botched 8 years earlier, was finally conferred. Apparently, a change in government and the return of a friendlier government made that easier. It is significant to note, however, that the restoration of the honors to Rawlings during Mahama's tenure did not extend to J.A. Kufuor and 4 others who had been nominated along with Rawlings in 2005, but whose honors had been curtailed. Was the selective exercise by UDS meant to nullify the previous and give this a fresh start, or was it done in part retaliation for the previous Bosch Award? And now that a pro-Kufuor government is in power today, will Kufuor's honors, suppressed in 2005 and again omitted in 2013, be finally restored 12 years after? While I leave that to the UDS, I must, however, lament a great opportunity UDS squandered in 2005 and again in 2013 to have celebrated the consolidation of Ghana's democracy through a rare exhibition of tolerance and accommodation in the conferment of honorary degrees. The political canker of winner takes all appears to have been carried rather too far into academia. After 3 successful power alternations in Ghana, this scourge should yield to a higher level of freedom, where the true weight of institutional autonomy is felt in the academic honors conferred, and when one completely banishes partisan politics from the realm of title investiture. Indeed, Ghana's imaginary Hall of Fame should be big enough to accommodate 2 giants and many more. Now, the 2014 saga of the Gate, the demolition of Legon's Gate in 2014 by security agencies, should therefore be seen against a rather stressful epic of encounters between governments and academia since the university achieved its autonomy in 1961. In its wake have been sporadic clampdowns on academics, dismissals, intimidation, harassment, damage to university property, and a general denigration of intellectuals and the academic agenda, most of these happening during dictatorships. The 2014 incident, however, takes on a different character and happens while the world applauds Ghana for successful cycles of constitutional democracy. It starts from earlier consultations by the university with the Ministry of Roads and Highways about Vice Chancellor Ayite's plans to construct a toll booth to collect tolls for certain categories of motorists using the university roads. The agenda was to raise money to defray the high cost of repaving the roads, which had been badly damaged. That rare initiative had been lauded by the ministry, and the toll booth was to double as a security gate. Was constructed with the ministry's technical support. Public education on this through the media started in 2013, 1 clear year before it started, followed by pedestrian engagements. From 2000, traffic build-up from trotro and taxis hitherto unknown was visible across campus, and faculty commuting from offices to residential sites had to join long traffic jams from vehicles that were using Legon as a thoroughfare from Medina, Achimota, and so on. And all halls of residents were virtually bus stops, virtually. The university basic schools saw the danger this posed to primary school children and quickly erected fence walls and road ramps to protect children from criminal intruders. But beyond traffic overruns, Legon also became a site for unauthorized loggers and firewood retailers who saw in the Legon woodland an auspicious site for indiscriminate tree felling and firewood trading. Soon, rat hunters and rodent seekers from neighboring hamlets entered academia, often followed by a long cortege of skinny dogs with drooping tongues. And let the approach of a rat be felt in the bush, a hot pursuit started, with rodents scampering across the residential communities Little Legon, Aido Flats, and all, sometimes ending up behind your boys' quarters at 19 Lower Hill, Legon. Here, the gasping rat may seek refuge, perhaps under a freedom banner, knowing, of course, that many lecturers perhaps do not eat rat meat. In this particular case, the escaping rat was arrested by the hunting dogs. In the hunt for game, bushes and carefully cultivated plantations were burnt indiscriminately. Only God knows how many replantings the thick plantation around the registry has known over the past 10 years after frequent bush burning from hunting expeditions. In the midst of all this, campus security was compromised by loafers, idlers, and hangers-on, who took advantage of the situation and entered the university premises to steal property and assault innocent students and staff. The spate of armed robbery in 2008 and beyond could partly be blamed on this. Added to this was the stupendous rise in the student population over the period. From a student population of 682 in 1961, the number rose to 2,500 in 1971, then shot up to 3,429 in 1981. Up to 1991, the number hovered around 4,699. But the period from 1991 to 2001 saw a stupendous rise to 15,991, partly as a result of education reforms. Within the next 10 years, up to 2011, the number had more than doubled, from 15,991 to 38,562. Considering the current student population of nearly 39,000, plus staff, faculty dependents, one should understand the intractable challenges that confronted vice chancellors. If you add to all this the dense traffic mobility across the university, you would understand the bold move made by Vice Chancellor Ayite and the university to reduce wear and tear on its road and other infrastructure and seek other solutions. It was not surprising then, when Legon got the opportunity to revise its basic laws, the need to repossess the university was prioritized. And the university in 2010 quickly took steps to assert control over its property. And I salute here Professor Kofi Kumado and members of his committee who drafted the revised laws for their foresight and circumspection. The University of Ghana Act 2010, which repealed the 1961 Act, that's Act 806, responds to the situation through Article 3, Clause 2. A person who is not a member of the university shall not enter or have access to the facilities or privileges of the university without the permission of the university, unquote. This provision gives the university the right to check identification of suspected intruders, as well as subject individuals and vehicles to search when the need arises. No such provision existed in the repealed University of Ghana Act, since pedestrian and vehicular intrusions, as well as student numbers, were not a major issue, except that the university sought to preserve its distinct space that time by an oblique message at the main entrance that simply said, University of Ghana, private property. Let me conclude in these words. The demolition of the gate without due process then was a clear infringement of the university's privacy, and was even more ominous. It took place after further negotiations with government. The structure in contention had been relocated, and assurances given by the university of its sole use for security checks. The original security coordinator, Begvulati, had even been replaced at the time. These reliefs, however, were not enough to stop a second demolition, again under the cover of darkness, again without due process. The siege maintained on Legon over the period had the trappings of unannounced security intrusions during periods of military dictatorship, which produced a climate of fear and suspense and disturbed the serenity of the premier university. The violent security operation also sets a bad precedent. It inaugurates a new protocol in conflict resolution, where a resort to force becomes the first option when dealing with an unarmed target. on a university campus that has several foreign students enrolled, representing more than 60 countries. The terror unleashed twice in 3 months and within 250 meter radius of international student hostels may have worsened the situation and portrayed the once stable democracy in Africa as a paradise lost. The implications of this for the university's external relations and foreign student enrollment could be damning. The pile of concrete rubble heaped at Legon's portals, which was a permanent spectacle until recently, was in itself a monument, symbolizing the damage repeatedly inflicted on academic freedom and the scars assembled in evidence. In an era of constitutional democracy, where the rule of law is supreme, the symbolism spoke volumes. It signaled a major setback of gains attained in the university's long walk to academic freedom. Happily, these have given way to a new structure currently under construction since 2016, which had been twice pulled down and twice resurrected. A resilient gatehouse sited on the precincts of the Academic Freedom Road. These are flashpoints of pain and memory, but in these also are sown the seeds of hope and relief, signaling a new dawn in constitutional democracy where our freedoms should never again be impounded. Let me salute the University of Ghana, past Vice-Chancellor Ayite, past Vice-Chancellors, the present Vice-Chancellor Ebenezer Owusu, respective councils and academic boards, and the Legon student body for living up to expectation and humbly heeding the call of the Legon anthem to arise, O Legon, defend the cause of freedom, proceed in truth and integrity to make the nation proud. Thank you.